Ah, hello.
Hi, welcome everyone. We're just going to give it a minute or two before we get started while people start coming in.
Okay.
Larry, you could probably mute yourself for a couple of minutes because we're going to introduce you first, okay? Perfect. Hi, welcome everybody. We're just going to wait for one more minute to get started while people are coming in. Okay. Well, looks like we're getting a lot of people coming in now, so this is great. Well, I wanted to welcome everyone to the Society of Government Economists, one of our virtual seminar series today. We are very happy that you're all here today for this exciting topic, understanding U.S. inflation during the COVID era. I wanted to let everyone know if you're looking for information about the Society of Government Economists, what we do, and are possibly interested in membership. On the slide I'm sharing, you can see our website. And please feel free to follow us on Twitter. We're also on Facebook. So you can stay up on the seminars that we have and about our annual conference and the SGE sessions at ASSA. So I think I am going to, my name is Christina Miller. Sorry, I did not introduce myself. I am the Vice President of the Society of Government Economists, and along with Masa Golzadeh and Linda Luber, we work together to organize this seminar today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Linda to introduce our speaker. Thank you so much, Linda.
Hi, everyone. You may or may not have had a chance to read Larry's bio, but I want to tell you a little bit more. Yes, he is at Johns Hopkins, but did you know that he was the chair of the economic department for a period? He started there around 1994, but he's also been at NYU, Princeton for a while. He's had lots of students under his tutelage, and some of them have gone to the IMF, but one of his students actually became the finance minister of Peru. His name was Miguel Castiel. Larry has studied inflation his whole career. He's been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Banks of Boston, Kansas City. I could go on, but he's also been at a number of foreign central banks as a scholar. He is the author of The Fed and the Lehman Brothers, Setting the Record Straight on Financial Disaster. He looked at what the Feds did or did not do. He actually sued the Federal Reserve under the Freedom of Information Act. He received free public litigation help, but he still lost that act, suit. Anyway, Larry is a quite famous man in my mind. I mean, Google Scholar puts him at papers cited over 22,000, but at the same time, I consider him a friend. Larry, please, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Linda. And I'm very happy to be here, and I'm on.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, yeah, I'm very happy to be here, hoping for a good discussion. As Linda alluded, I've written a lot of papers over the decades, and for this one, the one thing I think I've gotten right for sure is choosing a topic that people are interested in. It's not always been the case of all my research, but I think it's probably not a hard sell to say we're interested in why inflation has gone up and what's going to happen going forward to inflation. So I won't spend too much time motivating the basic question. I'm going to describe research in progress that I'm doing with Daniel Lee and Prachi Mishra, who are both at the IMF. And this is actually research in progress. We're going to present a paper at the Brookings Panel Conference in early September. And I apologize in advance for the quality of the slides, which are a little bit rough. And so I plead research in progress as the excuse for that. So again, the question is challenging, but pretty straightforward to state. Why is inflation so high? I should say, by the way, as Linda said, I've been studying inflation for a long time. There were a few decades there where inflation was not a very hot topic. It is once again. I feel kind of nostalgic for when I was in high school and there were the oil shocks and stagflation in the 1970s. It's really been a very big surprise that after inflation seemed to have been beaten out of the US economy for several decades, that it suddenly reemerged with such force. So I want to try to understand why, and this will largely involve, there aren't really a lot of shocking new ideas. We'll look at things like the tightness of the labor market, how much has that contributed to inflation, the role of the different shocks we've all heard of, energy prices, supply chains, chip shortages, and so on. But we'll try to quantify some of those effects and then using sort of the best understanding and quantification we can get about what's happened so far, try to talk about what's going to happen going forward. Now, in the basic framework we're using, there's no question that the Federal Reserve has the capability to bring inflation down. And also not very much question, I think, that they're determined to bring inflation down. So just if we do unconditional forecasts, I think there's a very high probability that 2 or 3 years from now, inflation will be quite a bit lower than it is now, because the Fed has the tools and will use them. I think that the big question is how costly will that be? Again, going back to my nostalgia about my youth, in the early 1980s, the Fed under Paul Volcker showed that it's possible to push inflation from 10%, down to 3 or 4% pretty quickly. But the cost was a very deep recession with unemployment over 10%. And the question is, will getting inflation down, again, require, a very strong monetary tightening and a very painful recession? The Fed is currently saying, no, it won't. And I'll get to this in more detail, but the Fed is forecasting that, yes, they're raising interest rates, and yes, unemployment will drift up a little bit. It's now about 3.5%. They have it drifting up to 4.1%, but still very low by historical standards. And their story is that that will be enough tightening so that inflation will drift back down pretty quickly to around their 2% target. Just to, I started to say give away the punchline. There isn't really a punchline in the sense that, we're going to talk about different scenarios, and anybody who tells you that they really know what's going to happen to inflation or how costly they'll bring it down, you should probably listen to somebody else, because they're just, we'll try to sort of lay out, what are some of the scenarios, what factors will determine which scenarios happen. I think, though, to summarize my best guess, we'll talk about, a number of key factors, such as what happens to inflation expectations, about what happens to the beverage curve, the relationship between unemployment and vacancies, which is a big factor. I think if you make really the most optimistic assumptions that are at all reasonable about all the relative factors, that the Fed is right, that they can get inflation down at modest cost. On the other hand, when you start making any of the assumptions more pessimistic, then the results look more pessimistic. So, I guess I would hazard, the statement that it seems more likely than not that everything will not go perfectly, and that you will have more unemployment needed to reduce inflation than the Fed is currently forecasting. So that's just a preview of where I am going. All right. So to sort of get into it, again, we're interested in understanding inflation. Now, the central part of our method for analyzing this question is to decompose inflation into two components. And so I think my understanding is it's a somewhat heterogeneous audience. So some of this jargon will be very familiar to people who follow monetary policy, maybe not so familiar to other people. But we decompose headline inflation, the number you see in the news. So headline CPI inflation over the last 12 months was 9.1%. We decompose that variable into core inflation, and then deviations of headline inflation from core. And that's a standard approach in analyzing monetary policy. Economists and the Federal Reserve talk a lot about this is what's happening to headline inflation, this is what's happening to core inflation, with the basic idea being core inflation is a relatively stable measure of inflation that filtered out transitory effects of different events that cause inflation to fluctuate from month to month. So we're going to be, to some degree, following standard practice of saying, let's understand core inflation and the deviations from core. And, core inflation, we're going to have, loosely speaking, a Phillips curve framework, which is to say we're going to explain movements in core inflation with movements in expected inflation, and then with slack or tightness in the labor market. And again, getting a little ahead of the story, but no big surprise, we're going to argue that a very tight labor market has pushed up core inflation. And then deviations from core inflation are the crazy month-to-month fluctuations that we see because of events in certain industries. So to take extreme examples, in April 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was headline inflation was very negative for that month, and reflecting the fact that airfares went down by 95% or something like that. Hotel prices went down by 95%. So those industry-specific events had big effects. More recently, as inflation has risen, we had about a year ago the huge spike in used car prices, all the other effects of supply chain problems. We interpret those things as causing prices in different sectors of the economy to move around by large amounts and cause deviations of headline from core. Now, the way in which we differ from a lot of analysis by economists and people at the Fed is how we define core inflation. So I, for many years, have been a huge fan of the median inflation rate as constructed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. So the idea of the median inflation rate, again, I'm sure some of you have heard of this, others have not, is the headline inflation rate is the average or the mean of price changes across industries weighted by the importance of different industries in the economy. So the Cleveland Fed, instead of looking at the mean across industries, looks at a median that they construct of industry price changes, again, accounting for the fact that some industries are bigger than others. As I think I learned in intermediate school, medians filter out the effects of big outliers, which can have big effects on means. And so it's a natural way to filter out unusual shocks to different industries. And again, I've thought for a long time. So the traditional measure of core inflation, as many of you know, is simply the inflation rate excluding food and energy prices. And that dates back to the 1970s, when there were big movements in inflation that were largely due to food and energy prices. And so the pragmatic thought was, let's just take out food and energy prices, and then we get core inflation, which is more stable. The advantage of the weighted median is we say, let's take out large price changes in any industries they happen in. So if there's a big energy price change, the median filters that out. But also if there's a big change in airfares or a big change in used car prices, that also gets filtered out. We have another whole paper about this, that for the pandemic period, just excluding food and energy still gives you a very volatile inflation series. And we think that the median inflation rate is a much better measure of the of underlying or core inflation. All right, so to get to that, let me now try to start sharing my screen. Okay, so people can see the pictures here. Yeah, okay, so these are the facts we're going to want to explain. We're looking at inflation since the beginning of 2020, up all the way through the most recent CPI reading, which is for June. I guess the July one will come out in a week or so. On the graph on the left, that is monthly inflation at an annualized rate. And that has been very volatile. So as you can see in April 2020, for example, we get that downward spike that at an annualized rate, we had -9% inflation in April 2020. And then it jumped up and jumped down. Recently, the big spikes on the right are largely reflecting energy prices. On the right, we have a 12-month moving average of inflation. And this is the number that gets quoted most often in the media. When you see a headline saying the new inflation number for the CPI is 9.1%, that's over 12 months. And when you average over 12 months, of course, you get something more smooth, but you get an upward trend. Now, the blue and the red parts, blue is core inflation, again, is measured by the Cleveland Fed weighted median, again, monthly and then your 12-month averages. And you can see even at the monthly frequency, it's quite a bit more smooth than headline. And most of the movements in headline are these red regions reflecting industry shocks that cause deviations from core inflation. Also, sort of getting into why this was all a big surprise, or why, and actually I'll talk about this in more detail later, but it's a slight digression now. I actually, with some of these same co-authors, in May 2021, when there was first some increases in inflation and in headline inflation, and Larry Summers, among others, was starting to write about the economy's overheated because of the Biden stimulus. We're going to have a big inflation problem. The Fed needs to start tightening policy. I actually wrote this paper in May 2021 with IMF economists basically debunking the idea that we should worry about inflation. We said, and other more famous people like Jerome Powell also said this, but I want to be clear, we were on the side also saying this is all transitory. A few months, people will be forgetting we ever worried about inflation. And of course, this turned out to be extremely wrong. And when we get into the nuts and bolts of what happened, I'll sort of talk about what we now see to have been wrong with our approach at the time. But the reason I think of it right now is if you can sort of peer at the 12-month graph at core inflation, sort of as late as I think it was as late as September 2021, 12-month core inflation was still lower than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. People like me who thought, oh, we should look at core, all this other stuff will go away, we're saying that there really isn't any inflation problem. Of course, what's happened since then is that the core inflation rate has started following the headline inflation rate up, and there have been continued shocks. So headline has stayed above core. So actually, as of June of this year, again, the 12-month average of headline inflation is 9.1%. The 12-month average of median inflation is 6.0%, which is less than 9.1, but of course, way, way more than 2.0. And, is an extreme surprise compared to anything we forecast before the pandemic. Okay. So we want to try to understand this experience and again, talk about then where are we going in the future. And again, the way we're going to do it is to first talk about what is driving core inflation, and then what is explaining the deviations of headline from core. And sort of by the way we decompose things, if we, to the extent we can somewhat understand what's driving core inflation and somewhat understand what's driving the deviations, we can add those together to see how well we can explain overall headline inflation, which is what people care about. The one other thing I'll say though, many economists, again, including us in May 2021, thought of core inflation and the deviations from core as being unrelated to each other. I think one way we've changed our view is that, as some economists have suggested, there seems to be an interaction that if you have high headline inflation for a substantial period, that gets passed through to a substantial degree into core inflation. So Olivier Blanchard is one person who's talked about this, emphasizing the channel of wage adjustment, that if headline inflation goes up and workers' real wages go down, there's more pressure for wage increases throughout the economy that gets passed through into core inflation. Also, to the extent things like energy are used as inputs in production throughout the economy, movements in headline inflation, again, get passed into costs and into core inflation. In explaining core inflation, we're trying to explain, which is the first thing I'll turn to, the bottom line is we're going to talk about slack or tightness in the labor market directly influencing it, but also about these headline inflation movements passing through into core. Okay, so it's kind of a long introduction, but I want to be sure that's all clear, and I can go quickly through some of the things towards the end. All right, so I want to go ahead now. Okay, skip that. All right, so okay, again, I apologize for my problems with the slides. Okay, so an important thing to say before looking at this picture is that I think an important development over the last couple of years, due to Jason Furman and Larry Summers and people at the San Francisco Fed, is to rethink how do we measure slack or tightness in the labor market. Of course, going back to when Phillips invented the Phillips curve in the 1950s, the unemployment rate has been used as a shorthand measure of how the slack or tightness in the labor market. And as many of you know, the unemployment rate today is low, but not extremely. It's 2 or 3 tenths of a percentage point below where it was at the start of the pandemic, and several tenths of a percentage point below what the Congressional Budget Office says is the natural rate of unemployment. So if you just look at the unemployment rate, the labor market doesn't seem that far from its long-run equilibrium. What has clued people off to the fact that the labor market is very tight is job vacancies. So most of you know this. The ratio, so there's currently about 1.8 job openings for every unemployed worker. The historical norm is something like 0.7 openings per unemployed worker. So we're way, as you can start to see, we'll see in this graph, we're kind of way off the charts of recent experience. I should say, by the way, I assume I actually happen to be in mid-coast Maine right now, but I've also was in Baltimore a couple of months ago. I think it's 2 different places. It's just remarkable how we can see the labor shortage everywhere. The most obviously probably at restaurants that are only open 4 days a week because they can't get staff. But I stood in line for an hour and a half in the pharmacy while customers berated the harried, understaffed pharmacy people, apologizing for we can't get enough people to fill prescriptions. And I'm sure you have. So there's this very severe labor shortage reflected in everyday experience, but also in vacancies. Now, so what research has established, if you go back now, even before the pandemic, with hindsight, it looks like looking at vacancies, not just unemployment, helps to explain inflation. But the effects were subtle enough before the pandemic, because generally unemployment and vacancies, move together in opposite directions. That basically, we've really learned from this episode that we need to look at vacancies, and that if we want, and I think, by the way, there's a fertile ground for figuring out what's the optimal way to combine different variables and look at labor market slack. But at the moment, I think if you want one variable, which is a rough and ready measure of labor market slack or tightness, looking at the ratio of vacancies to unemployed workers sort of makes sense theoretically. If you think about search and bargaining models of the labor market, vacancies and unemployment determine the threat points of workers and firms bargaining over wages. So they should affect how quickly wages rise and how that gets passed into price inflation. And then empirically, so turning to what we have here, I should say, by the way, to be clear, so in these graphs, the left-hand side, we call it the inflation gap. So this is core inflation, or the weighted median, minus expected inflation, as measured by long-term forecasts from the Survey of Professional Forecasters. The Phillips curve says that unexpected inflation, or the deviation of inflation from expected inflation, should depend on tightness in the labor market. So far, and I'll come back to this to the extent I have time, so far, by many measures, expected inflation has stayed fairly steady. So movements in this inflation gap are pretty close to just movements in core inflation so far that could change in the future. The variable on the horizontal axis, I realize I can't see the horizontal axis again, apologies for that, V over U, that's vacancies over unemployment. One important detail is, and so we have on the left, we have quarterly data, on the right, monthly data. V over U, we always measure as a 4-quarter moving average or a 12-month moving average in monthly data. So there's a lot of evidence from the past that labor market slack or tightness affects inflation with some time lag. It's not contemporaneous. And again, a simple way of capturing that is just looking over the last 4 quarters or 12 months. All right, so in any case, if you look, so the quarterly picture is easiest to interpret. So the red dots are so here we've color coded different time periods. The first thing to say is the blue circles are basically the 1970s high inflation episode, where inflation was very high. It was a very steep Phillips curve. We think that was sort of a whole different monetary regime with different expectations, behavior, different monetary policy. Also, there's actually an interesting paper by Summers and co-authors about, and again, some of you I'm sure are very familiar with this, the differences in how inflation was measured before 1982. And how mortgage interest rates entered directly, and that had a big effect. So I actually had a sort of a debate with my co-authors. I said we should just leave out the 1970s, not tell anybody, not bother people with that. And that'll make the graph look nicer. And they sort of said, well, somebody might catch us at it and accuse us of data mining. So there it is. But the more you can ignore that, the better. The sort of blue open circles, that's the long period from 1985 to the eve of the pandemic. So consistently low inflation. The Great Recession was in the middle there. And then the red dots are the pandemic period. And you can see, the last observations, 4th quarter of last year, first 2 quarters of this year, are in the upper right. And very loosely, if you sort of draw a curve through the open blue circles and extend it, the red dots are not all that far away. The gray squares, that's the 1960s, and so basically the late 1960s, with the Johnson fiscal policy and Vietnam War, that was the last time the economy was overheated, or the labor market was overheated, as measured by a high V over U ratio, where you have to go to be comparable today. And we think it's noteworthy that the inflation performance we see recently is not that far off from the late 1960s. Now, again, we don't actually include this in our regressions because we're a little wary, again, of we leave out the 70s, we put in the 60s, people will, think that's a little hokey. But I think it's, anyway, those are the facts. So, that's the data. Interpret them as you want. On the right is monthly data. And the monthly data is somewhat noisier than quarterly data, but you can see the same kind of message. All right, so that is Slack. And now the other thing I want to show you quickly, skip over this. This is the same graph as the last one, except in the inflation gap, we're measuring core inflation in the traditional way, the way the Fed does it, with the inflation rate excluding food and energy. And you can see then the relationship to Slack is in general much noisier and doesn't, if you look at the right in monthly data, if you use traditional core inflation measure, that jumps around all over the place, and it's not obvious that it's especially related to V over U. So, that's just sort of a footnote saying it really is important that we measure core inflation in a way that effectively filters out. So again, so for example, I don't know, can you see the little hand here that I'm, yeah. So, so this is April 2020 when the traditional core went way down because again of hotel prices, airfares. It's important to filter those things out to see the underlying relationship between core inflation and slack. Now, the other variable we look at that I'll just talk about briefly again is this pass-through effect. And long story short, we look at the deviation of headline from core over the previous 12 months. Again, with the idea that what we call headline shocks, deviations from core, will over time feed into core inflation. So sort of one of our main empirical exercises is to say, all right, let's just start running some regressions. And for the regressions, we start in 1985, so we don't include the 70s or the 60s. Let's see how much of this inflation gap, again, measured this way, how much we can explain with V over U, and then how much we can explain with this pass-through effect. Now, again, as I'm sure many of you know, a number of people have argued that there are nonlinearities in these effects. So Joe Gagnon of the Peterson Institute, among others, has suggested that slack has a very nonlinear effect on the Phillips curve, depending on whether the labor market is tight or not tight. The marginal effect of changing tightness can be different. When Olivier Blanchard writes about pass through some headline shocks, he suggests some nonlinearity. He says, well, maybe wage setters ignore small changes in headline inflation, but if there are big changes, that's salient, so big changes that disproportionate effects. So our approach, for better or for worse, is to say, well, some people think they're non-linearities, maybe not, we don't know. Let's just put in cubic functions of V over U and a cubic function of this pass-through variable, and maybe it'll look linear, maybe it'll look non-linear, or maybe we can't tell, but let's see. So, I'm not going to really show you. So here we do a bunch of regressions. Don't even worry about the numbers. Again, we do it quarterly and monthly. We do one version where we stop before the pandemic, and one version where we include the pandemic. And so again, you can see these slack and slack squared and slack cubed and headline shocks squared and cubed. Rather than try to look at the coefficients, which are hard to interpret, let's look at these pictures. So this is this is how V over U affects core inflation according to our estimates. So here we're saying, suppose the headline shocks are all zero and we just increase V over U, how does that affect inflation, which we can derive using the coefficients on slack squared and slack cubed. And for better or for worse, we find some nonlinearity that's sort of, in the middle, which is sort of the levels of V over U that we see most commonly, somewhat below 1. The relationship is fairly flat. It gets steeper either at low levels of V over U or at high levels of V over U. And so this, taken at face value, supports the people who say, well, there's a nonlinearity such that when the labor market gets really tight, it starts really having a big effect on inflation. And we need, on our to-do list, by the way, is putting standard errors around this. We haven't done that yet. Although you see in the regression coefficients, all the things are estimated pretty precisely. So we think this is reasonably precise. So this is the effect of the pass-through from the headline shock. And here actually we have quite a striking nonlinearity or even asymmetry. So if you can see where 0 is around here, over quite a range, if you have negative headline shocks, it does not get passed through into core inflation. But if you have positive headline shocks, they do get passed through. And if you actually, currently we're at a number like 3 point something, that has a big effect on core inflation. We weren't especially expecting this. If our lives depended it, we could sort of make up some explanations ex post that might have, but I'm not going to, I'll just sort of say that's what the data says for now. All right, now, something we're very interested in is, okay, does this specification explain what's happened in the pandemic? So here we have sort of actual value and fitted values. And I want to focus, we have two graphs depending on the time span. I want to focus primarily on the one on the bottom, which is where we use parameter estimates that are estimated from 1985 to 2019 before the pandemic. Actually, the results are pretty similar whether you do or don't include the pandemic. But I think that the ones that exclude the pandemic are more interesting because they're essentially out of sample forecasts, giving, saying, do we have the increase in core inflation that we should expect, given what's happened to Slack, given the headline shocks, but based on how inflation behaved before the pandemic. We want to argue there's a pretty, so here the black line is, again, a monthly series, but annualized for median, actually it says median inflation is median inflation minus expected inflation for the inflation gap. The black line is the actual experience, the red line is fitted values, and the fitted values are pretty close to the actual values. The blue line, the blue dashed line, that is the fitted values that you get if you say, okay, what if we'd had the levels of V over U we actually had, but it had no headline inflation shocks. So that's a way of isolating the effects of Slack. And, to a very rough approximation, we want to say that it looks like Slack explains something like half of the increase in inflation. It explained less than that early on, a little more than that in the most recent months. But, as a very rough and ready rule, something like half of the inflation is explained by Slack, and then the other half by this pass-through of headline inflation shocks. Okay, so I want to speed up. This is something people are interested in. So just giving the bottom line quickly. So obviously something that's been debated a lot is how much of this rise in inflation can we blame on the American Rescue Plan, the Biden stimulus? Many economists and many Republican politicians have said we haven't, it's the fault of the stimulus, overstimulus, that we have inflation. Now, presumably the stimulus strengthened demand and strengthened the labor market and raised the vacancy unemployment rate. So to some degree is one contributor to the overheated labor market and inflation. We try to estimate the contribution. To do this, there's a study by Barnashon and co-authors of the San Francisco Fed, which estimates how the stimulus plan affected vacancies and unemployment. And we just, sort of take from their study and estimate. So in the upper right-hand part of this graph, that is how, the blue is what actually happened to V over U. The red is what it would have happened without the stimulus, according to research of the San Francisco Fed. And then what we do is to say, okay, if they're right about that, let's use our inflation equations to figure out what happened to inflation. And so at the bottom, at current monthly rates, the number that falls out is 2.9 percentage points. So without the Biden stimulus, core inflation would have been 2.9 percentage points lower in June than it was. If you the effect is growing over time. If you smooth over 12 months, the effect is 0.9 percentage points. So, you know, whether that's those effects are large or small, or, you know, whether, you know, this is or should be ammunition against the Biden administration, or whether this amount of inflation was worth it for the benefits of a faster economic recovery, others can debate, but that's our contribution on that. Okay. So, you know, I'm going to skip over some of the details. We have another section on let's explain the headline shocks. And, you know, what we find there is, I think, useful, maybe not at all surprising, that there's a big effect of energy prices. Also, a significant effect of car prices, that when we decompose things, especially in the middle of 2021, the rise in used car prices and other, actually just recently rented a car, and it's crazy what rental cars cost. That contributed. There's also a variable which helps explain it, which is interesting. There's a private firm called, I'm getting the name wrong, Market Economics, that has an index of order backlogs in different industries in the economy. And that has substantial explanatory power, that when this index says there were a lot of order backlogs, which presumably captures something about supply chains, that we got headline inflation going up more. But let me not, again, you know, I'd be happy to come back if people have questions, but I want to sort of get through the main things pretty quickly. So I want to get on. So of course, you know, what people would really like to know is not, okay, we know inflation rose, we know there were, you know, this or that happened to the economy, what's going to happen going forward? And again, let me try to go through this fairly succinctly. So first of all, we're not going to make any unconditional forecasts of inflation. It's going to depend a lot on how much the Fed tightens and how much the unemployment rate rises and vacancies fall. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at different scenarios. So actually one, which we actually have not finished yet, but might end up being the most interesting, is, well, suppose we take the Fed's forecasted path from the FOMC of unemployment going up gradually to 4.1%, what will happen to inflation in that case? Actually, in the results that I'll show you, sort of our baseline, partly reflecting where my two co-authors come from, is the IMF's forecasts of unemployment, which are somewhat more pessimistic from the Fed than the Fed. The IMF forecasted unemployment peaks at 5.4%, which is, you know, not a horrible recession, but is higher than the Fed. We'll also talk about Larry Summers made waves a few weeks ago by making a speech saying unemployment has to be 7.5% for 2 years to get inflation under control. So we'll look at this sort of, you know, somewhat doomsday Summers scenario. Now, even once we specify an unemployment path, you know, what happens depends on other things. You know, an obvious qualification is, you know, we don't know what shocks will happen in the future. You know, maybe, you know, heaven forbid, there will be more, you know, maybe the Ukraine crisis and the disruptions of the oil market will get worse, you know, and gasoline will go to $8 a gallon, you know, or maybe not, maybe things will get resolved and gasoline prices will go way back down. You know, maybe there will be worsening supply chain problems, maybe that'll all be improved. You know, we're going to have a baseline of sort of no more big shocks in either direction, which is a reasonable baseline, but we could get very lucky or very unlucky depending on shocks. Even with that qualification, we think there are two more big uncertainties. One involving the beverage curve and one involving inflation expectations. So briefly, again, those of you who have been following the debate about inflation, there's sort of an important sub-debate about the relationship between unemployment and vacancies and how that might change. So Governor Waller at the Fed and other Fed officials have been talking about, well, the vacancy unemployment rate has to go down, but if we tighten policy just the right amount, vacancies will go down, and vacancies can go down, and so V over U goes down, but unemployment doesn't have to rise very much. We'll just sort of get rid of these excess vacancies. So actually the unemployment cost of making the labor market less overheated will be small. There's a paper just a couple of weeks ago by Blanchard, Domash, and Summers saying, well, that's ridiculous. In every previous episode of monetary tightening, as the labor market changes, we move along a beverage curve, we get lower vacancies, but also higher unemployment. So they think the Fed is way too optimistic about being able to cool off the labor market without an increase in unemployment. Now, what this debate is really about, just skip ahead, is about the position of the beverage curve. So the beverage curve, so it's been known since Lord Beveridge, I forget, many, many decades ago, that as the labor market gets tighter, vacancies go up, unemployment goes down. We have this downward sloping relationship. It's a funny kind of relationship in the sense that it seems quite stable over long periods of time, but then seems to shift at discrete points for reasons that are usually not very well understood. And one of the big shifts happened just at the beginning of the pandemic. So the light blue line is actually before the Great Recession of 2008. The curve shifted somewhat after the Great Recession. So since 2009, we've been on this in-between curve. And then, dramatically in April 2020, there was this outward shift. And we've been now moving up this. Basically, April 2020, there was a big increase in unemployment and not much happened to vacancies. So we sort of shifted out to the right to very high unemployment and low vacancies. As the economy's recovered, we've moved to the northwest, up this red curve like this, and now we're up here with not very unusual level of unemployment, but very, very high vacancies. And sort of the way to understand the state, sort of Blanchard, Domash, and Summers are saying, as we tighten policy, we're going to move back down the beverage curve and unemployment will rise a lot. The Fed position seems to be that the beverage curve is going to shift back. So we're going to be able to move, sort of downward with to the old beverage curve with lower vacancies and the same unemployment. And as you can probably imagine, we'll see when we do simulations, this will matter tremendously to what are the unemployment costs. Now, we want to be very agnostic about this. It's remarkable how little people have been able to explain or even really conjecture about why the curve is shifted. Sort of, taken at face value, it suggests an outward shift in the beverage curve suggests that somehow the labor market has been become less efficient at matching unemployed workers and job openings. Maybe there have been sectoral shifts, so the unemployed workers aren't qualified for the jobs that are open. Maybe unemployed workers are not searching as hard, or firms with vacancies are not searching as hard for workers. We don't really know, And since we don't really understand why the beverage curve shifted out, it's very hard to say whether it's likely to shift back or not. So, we're going to look at different cases. The other thing that I'll describe pretty briefly, because it's sort of obvious, is expectations behavior. So, for the last quarter century, monetary policy has been grounded on the idea that the Fed's committed to keeping inflation close to 2%. And if inflation deviates, it'll move inflation back to 2%. And that's become credible. Long-term inflation expectations are anchored. And, and that's a wonderful thing, because it means that movements in inflation away from 2% are largely self-correcting. That as long as people keep expecting 2% inflation, that will pull actual inflation back down. And, as long as we have a very overheated labor market, inflation will be high. But if we just get inflation, labor market back to a normal situation, then with anchored expectations, inflation will drift down to the Fed's target. And so far, by various measures, expectations have been fairly well anchored, even with high inflation, except just really in the last several months, there have been hints by various measures of different measures of expected inflation rising. So actually, for the survey of professional forecasters, long-term expectations, which we look at, in the first quarter of 2022, expected inflation was 2.5% for the CPI, which is actually pretty similar to what it's been for most of the pre-pandemic period. In the second quarter, it went from 2.5% to 2.8%. And it's really hard to interpret that. That number does wiggle up or down. If maybe one of the optimistic forecasters was sick and didn't send in his form or something, maybe that explains why it would wiggle a little bit. On the other hand, maybe that's the first, maybe it's going to go to 3.2 in the next survey and 3.7. And this is the beginning of, we're really at the cusp, I think, of seeing whether expectations are starting to de-anchor or not. I'm going to have a sleepless night. I think it's maybe August 11th or something like that, before the third quarter forecast comes out from the survey of professional forecasters. If expectations do become de-anchored, then we're back in a Paul Volcker situation where, high inflation is built into expectations, and then you really have to cause a very painful contraction and push, inflation way down below expected inflation and drag it down. So that's a nightmare scenario. And again, we're going to be agnostic about that. All right, so I want to wrap up pretty quickly, which I think I'll be able to do, because with that background, we basically do a bunch of simulations. So we pick an unemployment path, and again, our baseline is going to be the IMF path, and then we try different scenarios for we stay on the new beverage curve, or we go quickly back to the old beverage curve. Expectations stay very anchored, or expectations de-anchor to different degrees. And let me just show you some of the results. So here we go. So this is all for the IMF's scenario of different of what's going to happen to unemployment. That it'll peak at 5.4%, I think in 2024. Now it's just a little. We're still working on what's the optimal way to make this readable, but red and blue are different beverage curves. So a red curve means we assume, like Blanchard, Domash, and Summers say, that we're on this unfavorable beverage curve. And that's going to give us higher inflation, everything else equal, for given unemployment. And blue is the Fed's optimistic view. We're going to go back to the more benign pre-pandemic beverage curve. And then solid big dashes and small dashes are different degrees of optimism about whether expectations will stay very anchored or how quickly they're de-anchored. We have this gamma parameter about how quickly expectations move in response to actual inflation. Again, we could come back to people have questions, but I think what we want to take away from that is if you make the most optimistic assumptions about both, we go back to the nice beverage curve, expectations stay very anchored, that's the solid blue. And there, I'd say under any of these, there's sort of some momentum in current inflation. Things will get somewhat worse before they get better. You know, by the end of 2024, we're down to 2.2% core inflation under the optimistic scenario. And that's core CPI inflation. If you want to be precise about it, the Fed targets core inflation in the personal consumption expenditure deflator, which is typically 2 or 3 tenths of a percent below CPI. So getting core CPI inflation down to 2.2, you know, is very much consistent with getting inflation back to the Fed's target. However, if you start making more pessimistic assumptions about either the beverage curve or expectations becoming de-anchored, things are not as good. If you're pessimistic about both of them, that, you know, the worst scenario there, inflation is still 5.6% in the end of 2024. You know, maybe I won't, and again, if you want to ask me later, I will, but won't show you any more graphs. I have graphs for the Larry Summers, what if we push unemployment to 7.5% for the next 2 years? And that, well, I will show that briefly. So there were a wider range of circumstances in which you get inflation back down. But again, if you want to be really pessimistic about both the beverage curve and inflation expectations, you still actually get 5 point something inflation at the end of this time. So, you know, we're not happy about this, but, you know, taken at face value, if we have bad outcomes for the beverage curve and inflation expectations, either, you know, and I certainly would not, as a normative policy, say we ought to push unemployment higher than 7.5% or even as high as 7.5%. But the sad fact that our simulations say is that if that doesn't happen, inflation is going to stay pretty high. We're in process of the Fed's forecast and sort of compared to the IMF forecast, it actually still is the case that if you are really optimistic about everything, you know, the Fed might be able to get, I think in the most optimistic case with the Fed's unemployment path, you get down to 2.7% inflation, which is not all the way to target, but, you know, might be considered, oh, that's, you know, that's pretty good. You know, but again, you know, you go way off track if you make more pessimistic assumptions. So, you know, you know, not very inspiring way to put our conclusion is that many different things might happen depending on many different things. But you know, but I hope this will be sort of informative for, you know, understanding what might happen. And then in real time, you know, we're going to see, is the beverage curve shifting? You know, we're going to see what happens to expectations. And I think this is some guidance to what might play out with inflation in those different situations. So let me stop there.
Thank you. I guess we have like 3 main questions from the audience. Feel free to send me more questions if you got more. But I think like one person was, you kind of addressed it, like, was the stimulus package too large and like what percentage of inflation can be attributed to that? which I think we addressed that, but if you want to kind of explain more about it, feel free. I can, I'll tell you the second one. Maybe you can respond to all of them all together.
Actually,
Okay.
if you don't mind, that exceeds my cognitive abilities to have 3 questions at the same time. So,
Sure.
I mean, I mean, briefly on that one, it's again, we take somebody else's estimate of how it affected the labor market, and actually that. Go back to it, because this is obviously very important and interesting, and sort of central to political debates. So that actually you see on the right, V over U, you see on the left how much different unemployment was. And so it was something like 1 percentage point or a little more, so unemployment would be 4.5 instead of 3.5 without the stimulus package is the estimate. And the cost of that is inflation over the last 12 months would be 0.9 percentage points higher, although that number is now rising over time. So then, somebody could decide what weights unemployment and inflation have in the social welfare function and decide, is that a good or a bad trade-off?
Thank you. The second one is downward nominal wage rigidity and an explanation for why negative inflation shocks don't pass through to core inflation.
Okay, that is a great question. And to which I don't have a great answer. I think maybe yes. That somehow, and even just sort of thinking aloud, I mean, to the degree, so one thing, one question is what are the channels of pass through? And actually we have a little bit of that in the paper, which I won't get into, but to the extent, it could be partly just through firms' costs, although that actually you might think would be symmetric. To the extent the pass through was through wages, I guess the story would be if the cost of living goes up, workers get very unhappy if they don't get raises, and firms are somewhat responsive to that. I guess you could say you did absolutely a very logical explanation that if there are negative shocks, there are taboos on cutting wages, that's a very interesting hypothesis. That could be a good topic for research.
The third one is about wage price inflation spiral, and they're asking why we are not seeing the wage price inflation spirals, even though there is a little slack in the labor market.
Okay, so the whole concept of the wage price spiral, I think, is kind of confusing. I think when I think about things, again, the key things is inflation expectations. That basically is so if inflation expectations are anchored at 2%, people sort of take that as the norm for prices rise 2%, wages rise 2% plus productivity, and a tighter or weaker labor market moves you around relative to that. But to the extent with this pass-through effect, to the extent that prices get ahead of wages because of headline inflation shocks, wages might catch up somewhat to that. But I mean, we could go. I'm not sure that it makes sense that actually leads to a perpetuating cycle of wages and prices going up if expectations are anchored. So I think, I'm not sure I even like the term wage price spiral. I realize people use it, but to the extent we haven't seen in 1970s like wages go up, prices go up, wages go up, prices go up, is because everything's been anchored fairly well so far by expect inflation.
Another very interesting question is about the Fed changed its monetary policy framework in August of 2020 by moving to a flexible average inflation targeting, which implied a higher target. Do you think that this shift played a role in recent inflation dynamics?
So that's a great question. I would say not directly, but maybe the sort of views behind it played a role. So what I mean by that, sort of not directly, right? So I mean, it is a little, tragicomic or ironic that the Fed, the big announcement in August 2020 as well. We don't want to just get back to 2%. We want to overshoot 2%. And one could sort of sarcastically say they've been extremely successful in overshooting 2%. Of course, they meant getting to 2.3% for a year or so. I think, the fact that they were, maybe hoping for 2.3 rather than 2.0 over some horizon, is not why it's 9.1. They were just sort of overwhelmed by, all the shocks to the economy. Having said that, for a while have been in the mode of wanting to push inflation back down. Having said that, the Fed has had a very, dovish attitude to, use the jargon. People on, people on the FOMC making speeches from Jerome Powell to, Vice Chair Lael Brainard on down, talk a lot about the importance of a strong labor market and, bringing prosperity to all the people in the economy which obviously nobody would disagree with that, but, there's been an emphasis, there's been, somebody might have actually done this, if you sort of compare Fed speeches to, what was going on in the Greenspan or certainly Volcker eras, there's a lot more talk about full employment relative to the primacy of keeping inflation under control. And I think that was, partly led to, their new framework, and also partly, helps explain, why they, so I'm going to use not normative terms, why they did not start raising interest rates as quickly as some people thought they should start raising interest rates. That they were, really putting a primacy on, not unnecessarily choking off the recovery. Time will, so, certainly, Larry Summers, other people essentially say, they've made a mistake, by, not sort of nipping in the bud or, as quickly as possible controlling inflation. Now inflation is going to get really high, it'll get built into expectations. It'll ultimately be very painful to reduce it. The Fed's view is still, I think they've been fairly forthright in saying, if they know everything that they know today, if they'd known that 6 months ago, they would have started tightening somewhat more quickly. But, I think they still say, that there's a path towards, the dreamed of soft landing, that we can bring inflation down without. But anyway, so that's a long-winded answer. But I think things would have played out somewhat differently if Paul Volcker were running the Fed rather than Jerome Powell, probably.
Just in parentheses, this is my kind of idea about I heard that his experience with taper tantrum was kind of really bad for his kind of being a little bit late into increasing the rates. I just wonder what you think about that.
Yes, yeah, that's plausible. That could have played a role. That they, absolutely. Because of experiences, particularly the taper tantrum, they're very worried about surprising markets with sudden shifts. They want to sort of telegraph things way in advance. and the further in advance you telegraph things, the less flexibility you have to change quickly without deviating from what people are expecting. So, they sort of set off on a, very gradual approach to tightening. And I think, feared effects of shifting too quickly from that. Absolutely, that seems like one factor.
Another very good question is on Build Back Better. And I think one of our audiences is interested in like how that could affect these vacancies, and like by helping on subsidized childcare and things of that sort would kind of help the labor force participation and filling the vacancies faster.
Okay, now of course there's the original Build Back Better. That there's the bill that looks like it's probably going to become law. Given Senator Manchin's getting on board, where and this really is kind of, I don't know what to say about this. It's called as I'm sure you all know, called the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the name they put on something for climate change and various tax changes, which is, I guess they really want to make the point it's not going to be inflationary, so they give it that, even though that's it's more about saving the planet from climate change than it's about inflation reduction. The original bill, and I'm not an expert at this. My understanding is, a lot of the, preschool education and sort of social programs like that in Build Back Better are not going to be, or are not in the bill that'll probably become law. Certainly there's a strong case that things like preschool education, aid to families, things that address poverty would, in the long run, make people more skilled, more employable, would reduce unemployment, would be a reason for shifting the Beveridge curve inward. Those, even if that had been passed, those are pretty long, that it's going to take a while before the 4-year-olds in preschool, start contributing to the economy. So it's not that relevant for the current inflationary episode, but certainly in the long run, in sort of improving the trade-offs and having a more full version of sustainable full employment. There's a strong case that would have helped, and that was a missed opportunity. I think that the law that's actually looks like it may become law. Again, I'm not an expert. I think there's a lot of press. A group at the Wharton School did simulations and said there's going to be a negligible effect either way on inflation, and that sort of seems right to me. Again, I think policies that mean the planet is not underwater in 50 years, are very good for human welfare, but probably don't have much effect either way on inflation over the next 2 or 3 years. There's some revenue increases, some expenditure increases over a long period of time. Again, not a big factor. I sort of, in terms of policy changes at this point, the American Rescue Plan was, this, historically unusual event of this huge fiscal stimulus at a time when monetary policy was at the zero bound. It couldn't do much. I think we are sort of back to a more normal regime where it's sort of the Fed's going to decide, how tight or loose the labor market is for the next few years. And these other things are very important for the next 20 years, but not so much for the short term.
One more question. How accurate do you believe bond rates are forecasting inflation? Yeah, like the 5-year Treasury rate is still under 3%, and like, how do you think that is affecting the forecast of inflation?
So there are different measures of expected inflation. Of course, I tend to look at survey measures. I mean, my favorite is the Survey of Professional Forecasters. There's also a lot of people look at the Michigan Survey of Consumers. You know, other people look at financial market measures. You know, I mean, currently, I think, you know, they are broadly similar. That, you know, they all, although I guess now, and again, I don't follow the financial measures as closely as some, that the surveys have shown some sort of upticks in expected inflation. The financial markets may be actually just, you know, literally in the last few weeks, maybe some, I know, I look at Paul Krugman's Twitter, and he's always, you know, here's new evidence that it's all gonna blow over. And people citing, you know, some measures of, all right, but what's the point, or what's the question? I think, I think it's interesting that sort of, you know, all measures, you know, I've seen pretty darn anchored, you know, compared to what's happened to actual inflation, and we'll see how long that lasts. I mean, I for what it's worth, I mean, I tend the financial market measures, you know, they of course are not pure measures of inflation expectations. You know, there's all, if you look at, you know, index bonds versus nominal bonds, there's always a risk premium, you know, and I think there are even some sort of, you know, market microstructure things about, you know, if you eyeball too closely, you know, week to week ups and downs, there are a lot of things affecting them. I mean, you know, overall, I think it's hard to say overall, are surveys better than measures for financial markets, because, you know, they've given fairly similar forecasts. You'd have to have a pretty nuanced look at the data to decide which are better.
I think this is end of the questions, unless there are more.
Could be enough. I've rarely been in a seminar that's gone more than an hour and a half, you know, when I would have been really sad if it had stopped after an hour and a half. So.
Oh, I think there was one question that I missed. Do we have any measure to know, or maybe you have run a simulation that, like, without any stimulus, how much would we experience, and like the unemployment, how high the unemployment could have been without any stimulus, like any stimulus, I think the question is.
Well, so I mean, I think that's, I think the slide is still, I mean, if I understand the question, I think, you know, the answer that we assume is, you know, in this upper left-hand thing, the blue line is what we've actually seen, the red line is what we would have seen. So, you know, unemployment will be about a percentage point higher. I should say, I actually want, you know, to be honest, one thing I want to look at more carefully is this San Francisco Fed study that we took this from. I have no particular reason to doubt it, but I also haven't. Actually, the reason there've been a number of studies of the effects of the stimulus on the economy. Most of them look at the effects on output. We sort of pick this study because it's the one that sort of directly measures the effect on V over U, which is the variable we want to feed into our inflation equation. But actually, on my agenda is to look, is the study, you know, noticeably more optimistic or pessimistic about the unemployment effects of the ARP.
Just one last question. what is the impact? What impact do you think the COVID-19 had on reducing labor force participation and rising V over U? And how much of it is would be coming from supporting childcare?
Okay, so that's interesting. So yeah, so certainly, there was a big decrease in labor force participation, over the course of the pandemic. There was a huge drop at the beginning of the pandemic, and then it stayed low for a long time. But I think things have, and so for a while, maybe the latter part of 2021, these things change remarkably quickly. The latter part of 2021, the term "the Great Resignation" had, come into fashion, participation seemed to be depressed. Is that because people can't get childcare? Is it because they're still afraid of COVID? Is it just because they realize how much nicer life is without their crummy job? But in any case, but that has largely been reversed by this point. So again, I need to look at the most up-to-date figures, but I believe it's roughly accurate that prime age labor force participation, people aged 25 to 59, is basically back to where it was before the pandemic. I think total labor force participation is still somewhat lower because some people seem to have taken early retirement. And while some of them have unretired, not all of them have. So, but I think at this point, labor force participation is somewhat second order. Something, actually, I just looked at this pretty recently, something which, in terms of the labor force or the supply of labor is more first order at this point, is just the decline in the number of workers or of prime age people, as opposed to how many are participating. It's actually, I just looked, there's so many statistics. I looked at this just recently. If you look on Fred at the data of a graph of just the size of the potential labor for the prime age population, it has this upward trend. And then basically at the beginning of the Trump administration, it just flattens out. It stops growing. There's almost like a kink there. And of course, in the Trump administration, we have some understanding of why and part of that might be demographics. But I think a lot of it is immigration. And we sort of understand why in the Trump administration, immigration was curtailed. Since then, COVID has been a reason why immigration has been curtailed. So that's been a big thing. So actually, if you look at employment, just the raw number for employment, it looks pretty similar to its pre-COVID trend. So, the fact that so you could say, I'm not sure this is the best way to think about it, but you could say sort of labor demand, level of employment has continued increasing, but sort of labor supply has not kept pace because there's just not as many people. And so sort of that's why, why V over U is so high. Although, this needs some more thought, but also it doesn't quite work to say if people don't immigrate, sort of that explains the tight economy. Because if you don't enter the country and join the economy, on the one hand, you're not supplying labor, but on the other hand, you're not demanding goods and services either. So, sort of the level of demand per person is clearly very high. Again, the ARP probably being one factor.
There's one more question in the chat that I'm going to read for you. Do you foresee looking at long COVID impacts on and how it might impact the vacancies over unemployment? That's
a great question. I honestly don't have any expertise. I mean, If people are, if there are long-term health effects, although, well, yeah, if there are long-term health effects, that could have long-term effects on labor supply. There's actually, going back to the pre-pandemic, what was happening, labor economists wrote a lot about the long-term, very long-term decline in prime age male labor force participation. I think there it's quite different by gender, but sort of men ages 25 to 59, participation for several decades has been trending down. And actually, Alan Kruger, among others, in writing about this, emphasized actually health things, that a lot of these people who were dropping out were on disability. And one particularly, unpleasant part of it was, opioids as being a factor. I guess I'm just reminded, because I'm reminded sort of, trends in public health, do seem to have, affect trends in the labor market. So that's an interesting, what the legacy of long COVID might be. That's an interesting question.
Very much. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's all the questions. Very, very good questions. Great,
Great.
presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, we'd like to say thank you very much for, coming today and talking with us and, sharing your knowledge. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much, Larry. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for your virtual hospitality, and thanks everybody for the questions and for attending. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun and intellectual stimulation for me. Thanks.
Fantastic. All right, everybody.
And Linda, I will see you back in Baltimore.
We're gonna close out our meeting now. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.